Spasiba to all of you for coming. It's wonderful to have such a large audience for these issues about consciousness. Thank you also to Dmitry Volkov, to Professor Vadim Vasilyev and Professor Anna Kostakova from the philosophy department here for their hospitality, and to Professor Sadonici for his warm welcome as rector. As you'll see, I don't speak any Russian, I'm sorry. So my lecture will be in English, but it's a great pleasure to be here in Moscow, the home of the world-famous Center for Consciousness Studies, as well as being in the country that has produced such famous lecturers, such famous theorists of consciousness as Pavlov and Luria and Vygotsky and many others. One thing I want to do in this lecture is trace some of those connections. But the website, I love the website of the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies because it has a wonderful URL, www.hardproblem.ru. I hope you've all seen it. It's a great website. Their website is named after this problem, the problem of consciousness, about which they asked me to speak today. It's something I'm very happy to do. I want to trace a history of the problem over the last centuries, to talk about what's happened in the last few years on the problem, and to talk about what views I think might be promising to explore. But first, let me just say something about consciousness and about the hard problem of consciousness. The basic question here, I think of consciousness as the last great frontier for science, the thing we understand the least in the world, but which is at the same time the most familiar thing in the world. How can we explain consciousness? And especially, can it be explained in physical terms, in terms of processing in the brain? Can there be a theory of consciousness, a scientific theory of consciousness? These questions have been very actively debated, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, although of course they have a much longer history. Maybe 22 years ago, in 1994, I gave a talk at the first conference on Toward a Science of Consciousness, where I distinguished the easy problems of consciousness from the hard problems of consciousness. So, the easy problems of consciousness are to explain the objective functions associated with consciousness. Perceptual discrimination, integration of information, control of behavior, and verbal report. Can we explain those things? None of these problems are really easy. The name is really a bit of a small joke. These are as hard as most problems in the cognitive sciences, but at least we understand the method by which we might explain them, by giving an explanation in physical terms, by specifying a mechanism, a brain process, for example, which performs the function. Because we understand the problem in this way, the problems, at least, are tractable. The hard problem of consciousness is the big mystery, to explain why and how physical processes are associated with subjective experience. How is it that physical processes in the brain give rise to the inner life of the conscious mind? Seeing, and hearing, and feeling, and thinking. They all feel like something from the inside. But why is there something it is like to be me? I presume there's also something it's like to be you. This fact is obvious, but very difficult to explain. And why is it like this to be me? Why is it when I see colors and shapes? Why is the experience like this? How can we explain all this in terms of processes in the brain? It doesn't seem to be a question about objective functions. Our standard methods don't quite work. This is why we're faced with a problem, a very hard problem. So what I want to do now, well, to outline. Well, first, of course, I did not invent this problem. The problem has been around for a very long time. I want to first start by sketching some of the history of the problem. And then talk about the key argument that I think I've made with my formulation of this problem. I'll then look at some responses. Responses from materialists, on one hand, who think it can all be explained physically, and non-reductive theories by dualists, panpsychists, who think maybe consciousness can be taken as primitive. I'm more sympathetic myself with the non-reductionist side. I'll also say something about machine consciousness, then to motivate some final questions about a science of consciousness and the form that I think it might take, centrally involving notions such as information. But to start with the history, they say everything in philosophy is footnotes to Plato. So here we have Plato and Aristotle. So it's somewhat surprising that it's not easy to find an explicit discussion of the problem of consciousness as we understand it in the ancient Greeks, like Plato and Aristotle. Certainly there are many remarks about the mind and the body, but the distinctive problem, how do physical processes yield a conscious mind, it's hard to find them. Perhaps it's because this problem needs a broadly materialist, scientific worldview even to frame the problem in the first place, and for consciousness to look like a mystery. You do find some hints in some ancient scholars. Certainly in Indian philosophy, there's in 600 BC already you find Brihaspati with some provocative remarks. Brihaspati says, earth, fire, air, and water are the ultimate existence. Their combination is called the body, senses, and objects. Consciousness arises out of these ultimate existence as the power to intoxicate arises out of fermenting ingredients. So here we see a view on the mind-body problem, perhaps some form of emergence of consciousness from fundamental elements. He's not very explicit. The Roman physician, Galen, 150 AD, has a beautiful passage where he says, a single body capable of sensation cannot be produced from many which are incapable of sensation. Sensation is certainly of a different genus than shape, weight, or hardness, which belong to the atoms, or than the others that belong to fire, air, earth, and water. Notice one thing is a point of convergence in Greek and Indian philosophy. It's all earth, air, fire, and water. Consequently, the body that is capable of sensation cannot be constituted either from atoms or from fire, air, earth, and water. The beginning of a non-reductionist approach to consciousness in 150 AD. Still, then we go through the long medieval period until modern philosophy is inaugurated by René Descartes, who of course had many profound and influential things to say about the mind and the body. Still, it's not easy to find a statement of the distinctive explanatory gap that consciousness poses. In Descartes, he thinks the mind is non-physical, but to find a clear statement of the gap, the hard problem, I think one needs to look at some other thinkers. One very interesting suggestion is by Isaac Newton. Of course, he considers himself a philosopher, though we now think of him as a physicist in the 17th century. Incidentally, it's quite striking to me how many of these profound and influential thinkers about consciousness had very impressive hair. We have Descartes, we have Newton. I think there may be some profound insight here. In Newton, we find this beautiful passage: to determine by what modes or actions light produceth in our minds the phantasm of color, produces in our minds the phantasm of color, is not so easy. The problem is quite hard. The problem is not easy. We find this in Newton. Is he making a distinction right here between the hard problem and the easy problems? The passage in context is a bit less clear. To determine more absolutely what light is, after what manner refracted, and by what modes of action it produceth in our minds the phantasm of color, is not so easy. But what light is, how is it refracted, how does it produce these phantasms? Maybe it's a question about the mechanism that gets you from the physical world of colors to the mind. It's not a clear statement of the hard problem, but maybe there are some elements. For a really crisp statement of the problem, I think you need to look to Leibniz, another philosopher with very fine hair. Also one, of course, who had a lot of interaction with Russian philosophy, with his interaction with Peter the Great. It's actually Leibniz that gives my title, the title of this talk, because Leibniz published The Monadology in 1714, which is just about, I guess it's 302 years ago. Close enough to 3 centuries exactly. In The Monadology, Leibniz has this famous passage that really, I think, states the explanatory gap. Moreover, it must be confessed that perception and that which depends on it are inexplicable on mechanical grounds. That is to say, by means of figures and motions. And supposing there were a machine so constructed as to think, feel, and have perception, it might be conceived as increased in size while keeping the same proportions, so that one might go into it as into a mill. That being so, we should, on examining its interior, find only parts which work one upon another, and never anything by which to explain a perception. This passage is beautiful for many reasons. The key idea that you only find mechanisms, nothing that explains a perception, is there. Maybe also in this idea of the mill, we have a precursor of the now common idea of a zombie. A physical system with many of the functions of a conscious mind with its conscious behavior, but without any consciousness at all. Why aren't we simply like the mill. All function, no perceptual experience. So this is a beautiful statement of the explanatory gap, but it doesn't actually get pursued all that much by Leibniz or by others of his time. For some really clear focus on the problem, I think around the mid-19th century, in a number of areas of European philosophy, you find this focus. There's a very well-known passage by Thomas Huxley, who now has fine facial hair. In 1866, he says, "How is it that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nerve tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubbed his lamp. The mystery is like the appearance of the genie." How is this to read, by the way? The typeface is not so clear. Is it readable in the back? It's okay. It's as mysterious as the appearance of the genie when Aladdin rubbed his lamp. There is as beautiful a statement of the hard problem of consciousness as has ever been given. So I think by the mid-19th century, everyone knew about the problem, and you can find increasing statements of it. Here in Russia, Ivan Pavlov actually is certainly quite sensitive to the problem, well known for his work on physiology and many unconscious processes. He's certainly very aware of the philosophical issues, mentioning them sometimes just to set them aside. In 1923, in his book on 20 years experience of studies of animal neural activity, he says, "Allow me to take this opportunity to express in a few words how we represent physiologically what I call consciousness and conscious. Certainly I will not discuss this problem from the philosophical point of view. I shall not touch on the problem of how the brain substance creates subjective phenomena, and so on. I shall only endeavor to answer provisionally what kind of physiological phenomena, what kind of nervous processes proceed in the hemispheres of the brain when we say we are conscious and we speak of our conscious activity. There we really have a distinction between the hard philosophical problem, explaining how the brain generates subjective experience, from an easier scientific problem, finding the physiological correlates of conscious experience. What people now often call the neural correlates of consciousness. So Vadim Vasiliev, who discovered this passage in Pavlov, I think correctly sees this as an anticipation of this distinction between hard and easy problems. Coming to more modern times, the American philosopher Thomas Nagel, who still is my colleague these days at New York University, wrote a famous article in 1974 where he really comes out and says it directly. Consciousness is what makes the mind-body problem really intractable. Without consciousness, the mind-body problem would be much less interesting. With consciousness, it seems hopeless. Okay, so Tom is a little bit pessimistic about consciousness, but here he has the insight that consciousness makes the mind-body problem hard. Okay, so everyone knows by this point that consciousness is what makes the mind-body problem very difficult. So certainly when in 1994 I said that consciousness was a hard problem, I wasn't really expressing any new or amazing insight. So okay, so here is some guy with quite a lot of hair sometime in the 1990s talking with a cactus in the Arizona desert. And in fact, when I gave this talk on the hard problem, it was in Tucson, Arizona, where this photo was taken. So what then did this add to the discussion? I mean, I should say that I've often gotten far too much credit for this phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. It is a wonderful, catchy name, and I'll take the credit for this catchy name. If you know the theory of memes, ideas that jump from one brain to another, this one has turned out to be a very, very powerful meme. So I think that's great, but it's not itself a philosophical contribution to formulate this meme. I do think it's useful to have a distinction between problems of consciousness. Because one thing we found at these early meetings on consciousness in the 1990s was everyone said they were working on consciousness, but they turned out to be working on very different problems. So to distinguish the easy problems of consciousness from the hard problem of consciousness proved to be a useful way to make that distinction. And after a while, people got quite used to the idea, okay, I'm working on consciousness, but so far I'm just working on the easy problems, not the hard problem. But most important for me, at least, is that these labels, the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness, actually encapsulate an argument, a certain argument against reductionist physical explanations of consciousness. And this argument, I think, is an important one. For me, this is perhaps the fundamental argument against reductionist physicalist approaches to consciousness. And it goes something like this. All you get from physical explanations is solutions to the easy problems. Purely physical explanations explain only the objective functions, the behaviors, discrimination, and integration, and report, and so on. It explains those very well by the means I mentioned earlier. Specify a mechanism that performs the function. And that's great for the easy problems. However, explaining consciousness, conscious subjective experience, requires more than explaining the easy problems. It requires more than explaining objective functions. If you're just explaining the functions of discrimination, integration, report, and so on, you haven't yet explained consciousness, because the hard problem remains unanswered. The hard problem can now just be posed as, why is the performance of all those objective functions accompanied by conscious experience? Why is there something it's like? So putting those two premises together, purely physical explanations explain only the easy problems. Explaining consciousness requires more than explaining the easy problems. You get to the conclusion that no purely physical explanation can explain consciousness. You need something else in your explanation over and above the standard method of using physical explanations as mechanisms to explain the performance of functions. If I'm right that that's all that physical explanation can do, then we need something over and above physical explanations. So that is at least an argument. And I think this is a powerful argument against reductionist approaches to consciousness. And then it at least clarifies the terrain of where we should go from here. Now, of course, over the last 20 years or so, there's been an enormous amount of work in this area, both in philosophy and in science. Nobody just left it there saying, hey, there's a hard problem. Many people then set to work have been working on answering these challenges with scientific theories and philosophical theories that address the hard problem from many different angles. Certainly, many materialists have argued with the premises of these arguments, saying, hey, perhaps the problem is not so hard after all, or at least there are ways for a materialist to respond to it, while other people have been developing non-reductive theories of consciousness that try to go beyond what physical explanations give you. There's also been a robust science of consciousness. And I want to talk about all three of these things in what follows. So first I'll talk about some materialist responses. So I like to divide the materialists into the type A materialists and the type B, depending on their attitude about the hard problem. First of all, we have the type A the type A materialists who say there is no hard problem. All we've got to do is answer the easy problems, explain the behaviors, explain the functioning, then you've explained everything. Any sense of a residual problem is just a mistake or an illusion. There's also the type B materialists who say the hard problem really involves just an epistemological gap. A gap in how we think about consciousness compared to how we think about the physical world. But not an ontological gap, not a gap in nature. That's type B materialism. A third view that can be considered materialist is panpsychism, and related views that say we should enrich our concept of the physical to include consciousness at the base. The physical world already includes consciousness at the fundamental level, consciousness or proto-consciousness. I'll be talking about this view later. I have more sympathy with this view than the others, but I would regard this view as very much on the non-reductionist side of the equation. So I'll first talk about the first two forms that are more clearly materialist. So first, the type A materialist. So here is our friend Dan Dennett. I hope you all came to see him when he spoke here. I guess it was 3 or 4 years ago now. So, and here is him holding up the poster of Dmitry Volkov's book about Dennett's philosophy, Boston Zombie. Dennett works in the Boston area at Tufts University, and he has claimed on occasion that he is, in fact, a zombie. He doesn't find that kind of special conscious experience that other people find. Although he's also said it would be very bad to quote that out of context. So I take it back. I don't think Dan is a zombie. But he is a type A materialist who says basically there is no hard problem of consciousness. Explaining the objective functions explains everything that needs to be explained. If you think so we just explain the discrimination, explain the verbal reports and so on. Someone else says, come on, you haven't yet explained consciousness. To which Dan says, I think this further thing you're talking about that you think hasn't been explained doesn't exist. It's really an illusion. So either consciousness doesn't exist or it does exist, but it's just really the process of discrimination, explaining that does explain consciousness. So this tends to go along with a view where consciousness involves some kind of illusion. The idea has actually been surprisingly unpopular in the last 20-odd years, but Dennett wrote this book, Consciousness Explained, around 91 or 92, and then many people said, well, he hasn't really explained consciousness, he's at best explained it away. Even these days, even people who look like arch reductionists, Francis Crick, Christoph Koch, Ray Kurzweil, Steven Pinker, most of them just acknowledge the hard problem and the mystery, which is an interesting development. My own view is perhaps the pendulum has swung a bit too far. And although I'm myself not a reductionist, I think the very deflationary type A view deserves at least some development and some focus. So 2 years ago, we had a wonderful event, a cruise in Greenland, sponsored by the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies. And the theme was to discuss consciousness and the mind-body problem, but the special theme, I think, of the cruise was to explore this view that consciousness is an illusion. So here are some people a few of us were on dinghies, we were on a sailing ship, but we got to land on these islands off the coast of Greenland. There's Dan Dennett, there's Andy Clark, there's Keith Frankish, all of whom hold the illusion view, as well as Jesse Prince, who actually holds a different view, and various fine people from the Moscow Center. And we were really exploring this view that consciousness is an illusion. So there's Dirk Pereboom too, who also has this view. There's Dmitry Volkov, who made the whole thing possible. Here's Nick Humphrey, who holds the illusion view on the deck of the ship. There's Dan Dennett. Keith Frankish has provided actually recently a very fine articulation of this illusionist view by saying, he says it's like Coca-Cola. The classic Coke, we just need to get rid of it. Some people think they can have a new Coke, Diet Coke, which still exists. It's like classic consciousness. Okay, no one believes in, we don't believe in that. But some reductionists say we still think we can have diet consciousness. Small consciousness, a little bit of consciousness. He says, no, strictly speaking, you have to say it's all an illusion and go for consciousness zero. Or here with qualia, the philosopher's term for aspects of consciousness. Not classic qualia, not diet qualia, but qualia zero. It's all an illusion. And Frankish has been developing this view in some recent work on illusionism about consciousness. So I think this view is important. We can functionally explain at least the things we say about consciousness. What we say about consciousness, my giving this very lecture, is a functional event. It's a behavior that might be explained by processes in my brain. You might think that once we've done this, we've thereby explained the illusion of consciousness. Now, I don't agree with this view, but I do want it to be developed. I think there are two big challenges for developing this view. The first one is to actually give a good physical, functional explanation of why we say the things we do about consciousness. I actually don't think anyone's even done that yet. If you look at the work of Dennett and Frankish and Humphrey and Pereboom, I haven't yet seen someone tell a really convincing story about the things we say about consciousness in physical terms. But I do think that maybe that's possible. And if so, then when it's done, it will provide a real challenge to opponents. But then, of course, the second challenge for these people is to show that that's all that needs explaining. Is it enough to explain what I say about consciousness? Maybe to explain consciousness in you, in other people. It suffices to explain their behaviors and their reports. But for me, it seems I have this datum of consciousness on the inside, and the problem of explaining consciousness requires explaining that datum. Now, of course, the illusion view will say you don't have a datum where you think you do. But at this point, we get into very delicate epistemological problems, including whether Descartes was right in saying this is the one thing we are certain of, that we are conscious. If that's right, maybe this datum can't be explained away so easily. But I think there is really room for progress to be made on this illusionism about consciousness. And we made some good progress on the boat, but more challenges ahead. Then there's type B materialism, which I hear represented by another recent visitor to Moscow, I believe, Patricia Churchill, who was also on this cruise around off the coast of Greenland. The type B materialists say that the hard problem involves an epistemological gap, not an ontological gap. And there's a particular version of this view, which is not the one, differs a bit from the one developed by Platt, but which has been developed by Pavlov and Ned Block and David Papineau and others. that says there's a gap between our concepts of the physical and our concept of consciousness. But consciousness itself is physical all the same. I think this is a very important view. It's become known as the phenomenal concept strategy. My own view is it can't work, and the reason it can't work is that if you look at it closely, it requires that our concepts of consciousness themselves have features that are not physically explicable. So it just moves the explanatory gap from consciousness to our concepts. But again, I think it's an important view to develop, and it really has been developed in interesting ways. I'm actually most interested in non-reductive theories of consciousness. I got into this field not to be a pessimist, not to say, hey, there's a big mystery here. I got into this field because I want to understand consciousness. And eventually, I would like to have a positive theory, a positive scientific theory of consciousness. If we're right that materialist reductionist theories don't work, then we need an alternative, non-reductive theories. And I think the obvious avenue to pursue is that consciousness is somehow a fundamental property in nature, not reducible to physical properties, but connected to them by fundamental laws. And this, some people think this is somehow unscientific. I don't see how this can be unscientific, because it's a strategy which is taken in many other areas in science, especially in physics, where we take space or space-time as fundamental, not further explained, but nonetheless there are scientific laws that govern it. We take mass and charge as fundamental. We still give theories of them by developing fundamental laws. On my view, that's what we have to do when it comes to consciousness. And the alternatives here roughly fall into 2 or 3 categories. There's dualism, which has physical properties in a physical world and a distinct realm of mental properties connected by fundamental laws that connect the two. There's also panpsychism, where consciousness is somehow built in at the basis of the physical world. And for completeness, there's the less popular option, idealism, a very traditionally popular philosophical view where the whole physical world is all in the mind. And I think all these views are at least worth taking seriously. I have sympathies myself with dualism and panpsychism. His dualism has been represented in Russian philosophy by the important work of Vadim Vasiliev, who has developed a very distinctive interactionist version of dualism in recent years, which has really helped us, I think, to understand some possible ways in which consciousness could play a causal role in the physical world, which is causally closed. I mean, the big problem for dualism is the traditional problem of interaction. It faced Descartes. If you have this non-physical mind, how does it ever affect the body? Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia raised this problem for him in his correspondence repeatedly, again and again. And although she was quite polite about it, it seemed pretty clear that Descartes never gave an answer that was at all satisfying to Princess Elizabeth, and I think she was right. The problem of interaction is a real problem. So, it's a real problem, especially in light of physical theories, which it appears are closed and autonomous, and leave no room for consciousness to play a causal role within physics. I mean, if you're going to look anywhere within physics for a possible role for consciousness, it's probably quantum mechanics that offers the best place to look. Many fairly standard interpretations of quantum mechanics say there's a strange event of wave function collapse that happens on measurement. Nobody knows what measurement is, but it seems that perhaps, it's at least possible, it has something to do with consciousness. perhaps there's a role for consciousness there. That's actually an avenue that I've been exploring recently, as have some others, and toward the end I'll come back to a possible way for developing this kind of interactionist view within the framework of informational ideas. I mean, basically, the options for the dualist are epiphenomenalism, no causal role for consciousness, which many find at least to be highly counterintuitive. My consciousness doesn't cause any of this discussion. Or interactionism, consciousness affects physics, which some take to be unscientific. I think there are at least possibilities for interactionism. The other possibility, the other view that's recently attracted a lot of attention is panpsychism. Here illustrated with a picture of the British philosopher Galen Strawson, who's really been developing and pushing panpsychist ideas in recent years. So the central idea of panpsychism is everything is conscious. Pan means all, psychism for mind, so everything is conscious. And in particular, consciousness is present at the fundamental level of the universe in fundamental particles, in electrons, in quarks, in photons, and so on. So there's some element of consciousness at the fundamental level. To many people, this seems counterintuitive or maybe a bit crazy, you have to be a bit nuts to think this. But you know, to many people in other cultures, this has seemed very intuitive. So I'm not sure how seriously we should take the intuition. I think this idea really has some promise, especially when it's combined with an idea from Bertrand Russell, that when it comes to the physical world, we really only know, science only tells us about the structure of the physical world, not about the intrinsic properties of the physical world. If you like, it tells us about the relations, but not about the intrinsic. It tells us what mass does, but it doesn't tell us about the intrinsic nature of mass. If you like, this is a version of the old Kantian worry that science and perception don't tell us about the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. And here, the panpsychist idea is that maybe the intrinsic nature of the physical world actually involves consciousness at the fundamental level. That physics actually tells us about the giant network of conscious properties in systematic interaction. So consciousness serves as the intrinsic nature underlying all that structure of physics, and is the causal basis for microphysical action. Then the constitutive panpsychist adds one more idea, that microphysical consciousness adds up. All these little bits of micro-consciousness somehow add up to our macro-consciousness, the kind of consciousness we know and love. If that view can be made to work, I've suggested it potentially offers a kind of synthesis of the best features of both materialism and dualism, a Hegelian synthesis, if you like. You have the thesis of materialism and the antithesis of dualism, and then if we follow Hegel or Fichte, we need to search for a synthesis. I think perhaps that synthesis could be panpsychism, which offers primitive consciousness, unreduced, as the dualist believes, while still holding on to the causal closure of the physical world, scientifically, as the materialist believes, yielding a causal role for consciousness consistent with physics and integrated within it. So those are many advantages for panpsychism. The problem for panpsychism is what's come to be known as the combination problem. How do micro experiences add up to macro experiences? How do you get my consciousness from putting together the consciousness of a whole lot of quarks or photons or electrons in my brain. This problem has many different aspects, all of which I've written about in recent work. The subject combination problem, the quality problem, the structure problem. And it's made more difficult if you don't want to allow new fundamental laws of combination, because they will tend to suggest that consciousness, macro-consciousness, once again is epiphenomenal, playing no causal role. So many people have been thinking about this problem in the last 2 years. It's been very exciting in philosophy and science. I also think it's fair to say, so far, no one has a solution. So far, nobody has an idea which has attracted anything like a consensus. But still a very active area of research. Perhaps, for reasons of time, I'll skip over the very familiar view of idealism, here illustrated by George Berkeley, which has been widely rejected in recent times, predicting a little bit of a comeback for idealism. The cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman has been putting forward a version of it. Panpsychists have lately been moving towards cosmopsychism, the idea that the whole world is conscious, that has a strongly idealist flavor. My own view is that idealism tends to lead back either to panpsychism or dualism. Nonetheless, I think it's a view that may well be worth taking seriously. But what I want to do at this point is to talk a bit about the science of consciousness, and especially through the lens of some issues about machine consciousness. Let's see how I'm going for time. How does all this connect to the science of consciousness? And how can a scientist contribute to the hard problem of consciousness? Well, in the last 20-odd years, numerous scientific theories have been put forward. Some of them are relatively reductionist, like neuronal global workspace theories of consciousness. Some are relatively non-reductionist, like integrated information theory, about which I'll say a bit in just a little while. But a number of researchers have developed quasi-empirical theories of consciousness that take consciousness to be fundamental and postulate fundamental laws. I'll talk about how that works in the case of information in a moment. But a key question arises: what should be the key notion in a fundamental theory of consciousness? My own speculation, it's an idea which has also been developed by many others, including Russian researchers, is that the key notion in a fundamental theory of consciousness should be the notion of information. And I want to motivate this a little bit by talking about the question of machine consciousness. Itself a question which is interesting to many people. Everywhere I go, people ask about the question: can computers be conscious? Could there be artificial consciousness? Can a machine be conscious? Well, we don't know how. We don't understand how it is that a silicon machine could possibly be conscious. But the same is true about the human brain. We don't know how a brain could be conscious. We don't know how a brain could produce subjective experience. The real question is, are computers worse off than brains? Is there something about computers that makes them worse candidates to produce consciousness than brains? And I would say so far there are no such reasons. So I have some sympathy with machine consciousness. At this point, though, we encounter some famous arguments against machine consciousness. Thought experiments about machine consciousness. There's the famous case of the Chinese room, developed by the American philosopher John Searle, who I guess has been here back in Minds, Brains and Programs in 1981. A version of which was anticipated by Ned Block, with his example of a whole Chinese nation simulating consciousness in his article, Troubles with Functionalism, in 1978. One of the most important discoveries, though, in this area in recent years is that all of these examples were actually anticipated by the Russian novelist Anatoly Dennett in his short story, The Game, written way back in 1961. I think this was discovered by a student of Vladimir. What was his name?
Andrei Rudenko translated this book, but I first heard about this story from Alexander Dobrokhotov, a famous philosopher.
Okay.
He has discovered.
Okay, so a long chain of discovery. Now Alexander Rudenko translated it. But if you look at this translation, the piece is actually remarkable. He has the central ideas of Bloch's Chinese nation. I'm going to read some bits of it. Here are Seoul and Bloch, who had versions of this, but here is Denitrov. And I'm told I should explain this is the writer and not the singer of the same name. Anatoly Denitrov, and he wrote this article, The Game, of course published in Russian, and it's about an example of some people standing in a football stadium following some commands. All these people are ordered to the football stadium, and they're given some instructions. When the layout was complete, the stadium looked like a large gym with 1,400 young people inside going to do exercise. Then came the professor's voice. Here are the rules. Binary numbers will be given to Comrade Sagarov from the Northern Stand. For instance, 1001. If the first digit is 1, Comrade Zagarov is to pass the number to the person on his right. Whereas all numbers starting with 0 shall go to the person on his left. I guess I should have just given the original Russian text to the translator to make it easier. I don't know if we're getting English to Russian, Russian to English, and then back again. So this is part 1. Part 2 is where he explains what they were doing in the stadium, all of them following these instructions. The next day he tells them, this is a sentence in Portuguese. I don't think any of you know what it means. Nobody in the stadium could speak Portuguese. However, it was you who yesterday made a perfect Russian translation. To save you the trouble of guessing, I want to explain what the game actually was. In short, you can call it a computing machine game. Each of you was either a memory cell, a total mechanism, a time delay line, or a simple switch. So the people were forming a big computer that translated Russian to Portuguese. Sorry, translated Portuguese to Russian. Remember that part of Turing's article where he said that to find out whether machines are able to think, you have to become a machine. Experts in cybernetics believe that the only way to prove that machines can think is to turn yourself into a machine and examine your thinking process. Hence, yesterday, we spent 4 hours operating like a machine. The people turned themselves into a machine, very much as in Searle's famous example. If you, being structural elements of some logical pattern, had no idea of what you were doing, then can we really argue about any thoughts of electronic devices made of different parts which are deemed incapable of any thinking, even by the most fervent followers of the electronic brain concept? I think our game gave us the right answer to the question, can machines think? We've proven that even the most perfect simulation of machine thinking is not the thinking process itself, which is the higher form of motion of the living matter. So there you have it, an argument against the idea that computation gives you consciousness, really an argument against machine consciousness that really anticipates the central ideas of Bloch's and Searle's better known much later arguments. Myself, I'm not convinced by any of these, with great respect to Dennett. I advocate a version of what's often called the systems reply. The consciousness of the stadium system is not identical to the consciousness of any of the people. There's the people, they're the components, but then there's the system as a whole. I think one can motivate this idea by thinking about, for example, gradually replacing my neurons by tiny little people in my brain that function like neurons and pass signals around. Just say, I speak Portuguese. I speak very wonderful Portuguese, as my partner Claudia knows. Here I am understanding my wonderful Portuguese, and then my neurons get replaced by little people. I will hopefully continue to understand Portuguese, but the people in there, the neurons don't understand Portuguese, the people don't understand Portuguese. Understanding is a property of the system as a whole. So I think the moral is we have to distinguish consciousness of a machine from the consciousness of any components of the system. And in particular, what matters is the information processed by the system as a whole. If you want to find a connection to consciousness, it's not from the local bits and pieces, it's the information processed by the system as a whole. And that then leads to the final idea I want to discuss, which is the role of information. So here we have informational approaches. Here is exemplified in the well-known Russian philosopher David Chalmers here in Moscow, who has been putting forward these informational ideas for many decades now, starting at least in the 1960s. So here is Dubrovsky from a relatively recent article about expressing ideas that go back much further. Every phenomenon of consciousness is a piece of information, since it's intentional and represents something. Since any information is necessarily embodied in its material bearer, in the given case, the bearer is a particular neurological process. This, in principle, provides an answer to the question of a necessary connection between the mental and the physical. Now, I think Dubrovsky leans more towards broadly reductionist and materialist views than I do, at least of a broadly functionalist kind. But I think you do see the key insight that it may be information that connects the physical to the mental. This is an idea that I've expressed myself in some work many years later. In my book, The Conscious Mind, in 1996, I put forward what I call the double aspect theory of information. Information has two aspects, a physical aspect and a conscious or a phenomenal aspect, always tied together. The fundamental psychophysical laws for a theory of consciousness should be formulated in terms of information. But still, this was somewhat vague, and I did not have any precise laws of consciousness formulated this way. One of the most exciting things to have happened in the last 2 decades is that this challenge has been taken up by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, who's put forward a mathematical theory in terms of information. This is integrated information theory, formulated by the Italian neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. And Tononi basically has a mathematical measure of information integration, defined by a complex formula, which doesn't matter here, but the amount, how integrated is the information processing in a system. And Tononi basically postulates that consciousness goes along with integrated information. The more integrated information there is, the more consciousness there is. And phi is a mathematical measure of information integration. When phi is high, high phi high consciousness. When phi is low, low phi, low consciousness. And this develops this as a very formal, very mathematical theory, which I think is very consistent with both the ideas suggested by Dubrovsky and the ideas developed by me 20 years ago, but now made much more detailed and precise. So this informational approach is very exciting. It can be combined with various different metaphysics of consciousness, with different philosophical views. I mean, I think the framework of Dubrovsky, for example, is perhaps best understood as a type A materialist approach. Consciousness is wholly explainable in terms of the dynamics of information. Explain the dynamics, you've explained everything. Nothing else needs explaining. And Dubrovsky himself says he thinks this leaves no explanatory gap, no real further hard problem. So, okay, I disagree with that philosophical gloss on information, but I think it's at least an important part of philosophical space. There's the type B view that says consciousness is identical to and inducible to integrated information, a primitive identification between consciousness and integrated information, as with the classic mind-brain identity theory. Again, I'll reject this view, but it's still an important view. The views I take most seriously are the dualist and panpsychist versions of the theory. On an epiphenomenalist version, integrated information causes consciousness. There's a closed dynamics of information and fundamental psychophysical laws that link that dynamics to consciousness. So physics, information, link from information to consciousness. Now consciousness on this view will not play a causal role in the dynamics. So consciousness is epiphenomenal. Now, my book, The Conscious Mind, 20 years ago, I expressed some sympathy with epiphenomenalism. Now I'm gradually less sympathetic with that view, so I'm especially interested in exploring alternatives where consciousness plays a causal role. One really exciting project I've been involved in recently is the possibility of an interactionist, dualist version of integrated informational theory, which basically combines integrated information theory with the old vague idea that consciousness collapses the quantum wave function. The trouble with that view is we didn't really have a mathematical theory of consciousness or any precise mathematical description of the process. But with a theory like IIT, this theory in hand, we might be able to formalize that kind of interactionism with bidirectional psychophysical laws. A law from the physical to consciousness, saying high phi causes consciousness. Above a certain threshold of phi, you get certain conscious states, as in IIT. In the other direction, you've got principles by which consciousness collapses the quantum wave function, and these can also be mathematically formalized in terms of states of integrated information never entering certain forms of quantum superposition. But it's a long story, a very interesting story in its own right. I was told I shouldn't talk about this in too much detail here because it's technical. But what it might lead to is what we might call IIIT, Integrated Information Interactionist Theory. High phi, high consciousness, and then phi sort of acts to trigger collapse of the wave function, leading to a role for consciousness in the physical world. It may even be testable in principle, though not anytime soon. Anyway, I'm working on this with a previous student, now a postdoc in physics, Calvin McQueen, and we're trying to make these ideas make sense. If you're really interested, there's a video of me online somewhere on YouTube giving a talk all about this approach. The final idea is the panpsychist version of IIT. And this is one is also very attractive. You see the physical world as a world of information with consciousness as its intrinsic nature. Information is everywhere, so consciousness is everywhere. The big problem, of course, is the combination problem. To solve that problem, we need to understand the principles of composition for information. I think right now we don't understand that, so we have not yet solved the combination problem for the panpsychist version of informational approaches, but there is a research program there. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, but let me say something about my view, just to conclude. I've already told you which views I'm sympathetic with, which views I'm unsympathetic with, and I do find myself with a bit of a divided mind about these very difficult issues. I would say, though, that I divide my credence on the hard problem of consciousness about 50-50 between panpsychism, related views like panprotopsychism, and property dualism. Maybe that's not quite right. Maybe 49-49 with 2% left for materialism. Because, who knows? I might be wrong. Dan Dennett might be right, for all I know, but most of it to panpsychism and dualism. If we can solve the combination problem, then panpsychism. If we can rigorously make sense of a causal role from non-physical consciousness in quantum mechanics, then interactionist property dualism. So currently, I'm really in a constructive mood lately, trying to think about and explore these paths to see which path might work best. I spent a couple of years thinking very hard about panpsychism. The more I think about panpsychism, the harder the combination problem seems, and I'm starting to worry the combination problem could be unsolvable, if that's right. So maybe today I feel the combination problem seems so strong that I actually tentatively favor the interactionist view, perhaps via quantum interactionist integrated information theory, or perhaps by some other path with consciousness playing a causal role in the physical world. But that's highly speculative. It has its own very serious problems too, so I think we're still in very early days. What will I think tomorrow? Who knows? But anyway, to conclude then, I think a theory of consciousness is best seen in the end of the day as an empirical project. Find a fundamental theory that best fits the scientific data about the physical world and about consciousness. But for now, it's also in very large part a philosophical project, a project heavily constrained by philosophical theorizing. We might hope that eventually we'll make the leap. Think solutions to the hard problem of consciousness might make the leap from philosophy to science. That happened, of course, with physics in the age of Newton. It's happened with parts of psychology, with linguistics, with economics. We might hope that the study of consciousness is itself in a moment of transition from being a mainly philosophical problem to being a more and more scientific problem. But we haven't yet, I think, reached that moment. So right now, it's a project where philosophers and scientists can fruitfully collaborate. And I think it's a project where, at least in the coming decades, we're going to see scientists and philosophers working together for, say, at least the next 30 years. And maybe, if I'll be just a little optimistic for a moment, maybe there's some tiny chance that in the next 300 years, we might finally have a solution to the hard problem of consciousness. Thank you.
Спасибо большое за лекцию. Это действительно большое событие для нашего факультета и в Московского университета. Но у меня возник вопрос, в принципе, не связанный с лекцией, а в большей степени с вашей книгой «Конструируя мир». Именно два вопроса. Первый вопрос связан с тем, что вы пишете о идеальном мыслителе. Идеальном мыслителе, который является субъектом познания, который может с помощью, может высчитать, Subjectivity тезис, то есть может вычитать определенные истины на основании базовых каких-то истин. И вы говорите об этом в таком ключе, что можно сделать путем пошагового вывода, путем каких-то определенных сложных вычислений. И первый вопрос связан с тем, что вычисление, важно ли для вас вычисление как определенная точка опоры для построения фундаментальной теории сознания. И второй вопрос связан с позицией, опять же, тоже с базовыми принципами и с ролью психофизического закона в базовый принцип. А именно, идеальный мыслитель. Он может узнать психофизический закон, и если он может его узнать, то на основании какого-то базового принципа, а именно PQT, который вы предлагаете. Если он не может его узнать, вопрос точнее в том, заключается ли этот психофизический закон в основании базы. Если он заключается там, то он уже дан мыслителю, он его не узнает, а просто получает. И с другой стороны, если он не в базовом принципе, он его может узнать, значит он не фундаментальный. Вот, можете прокомментировать?
Okay, let's try. So, this question was about, really mainly about a book I wrote 4 years ago, Constructing the World. And about, in this book I argued that ideally all truths about the world can be derived from a small set of basic truths. Then the question is, at least in the second part, what about the laws connecting physics to consciousness, the psychophysical laws? How could the ideal reasoner know those? Well, in the project of constructing the world, the fundamental laws are all built in to the basic truths. So, fundamental laws of physics are part of the very base that Laplace's demon uses to know everything about the physical world. If I'm right, there are fundamental psychophysical laws, they will themselves be in the basis that the ideal reasoner uses. This, of course, doesn't immediately address the question, how could an ideal reasoner know about them? I mean, the ideal reasoner, which I was concerned with, could I be?
Да, ответ такой, да, в книге «Конструируя мир» 4 года назад я спекулировал о таком идеальном мыслителе, который бы знал фундаментальные законы Вселенной, и вот часть этих фундаментальных законов были бы психофизические законы. Поэтому, конечно, психофизические являются фундаментальными основными элементами.
How, this is all, Laplace's demon is just given the fundamental laws. It's a different question how Laplace's demon could know about the laws. What would be the best way for an ideal reasoner to know these laws? I think it would be to study consciousness, to study the physical world, to find correlations between them, and ultimately infer the simplest set of underlying fundamental principles that explain the correlations between physical processes and consciousness.
Вот есть такая небольшая разница, что демону Лапласу даны все законы, а идеальный мыслитель он открывает их. Поэтому ему необходимо проводить исследования для того, чтобы узнать вот такие фундаментальные черты реальности, как психологические законы.
Можно?
Господин Чалмерс, спасибо за интереснейший доклад. У меня один короткий вопрос, в отличие от предыдущего. Скажите, пожалуйста, что находится за пределами нашего воображения?
I like to say, space is big, but our imagination is bigger.
Хотел сказать, что космос велик, но наше воображение гораздо более огромное.
Instead, I think that
Здравствуйте, спасибо за лекцию. Я бы хотел задать такой вопрос. Если бы, попроще вопрос тоже, если бы существовали технологии выгрузки нашего сознания на какой-то цифровой носитель, воспользовались ли вы лично этими технологиями, чтобы продлить жизнь и избежать биологической смерти?
do I keep my brain around or destroy my brain? It's a backup copy?
Нет, это какой-то из сценариев, когда вы именно переносите сознание. Я не знаю, к какому сценарию склоняетесь именно вы, но выберите сами.
So I upload my brain to a computer and the original brain is gone. I'm very happy to make backup copies, but if I destroy the original, it's difficult. But if it happens gradually, one neuron at a time is replaced by a silicon chip, and if I stay conscious throughout, and you gradually upload my brain to a computer, I think this is the safest way to do it. Because if I am there conscious throughout the whole process, ending up as a consciousness on a computer, I think this is the safest way to make sure it's me. I mean, it's the philosophical problem. There's two philosophical problems here. Will the upload be conscious? That's the problem of consciousness. And second, will it be me? That's the problem of identity. I'm confident it will be conscious if done appropriately. Will it be me? Very difficult question, but I think if it's done in this gradual way, that's the best way to ensure that it's me.
Да, и, конечно, приятно было бы Дэвиду, что создать свои копии различных носителях, однако он больше склоняется к идее о том, что если постепенной замены, если постепенно заменять нейроны мозга на их аналоги, компьютерные, на физические другие аналоги, вот если сохранять постоянство сознания беспрерывно, это наиболее безопасный способ. Однако, даже этот безопасный способ порождает две проблемы. Первая проблема такая онтологическая, проблема того, что насколько это будет сознательным, вот это устройство, на которое мы постепенно перенесли сознание Дэвида. А вторая проблема — это то, что насколько оно будет им. То есть проблема проблема личного тождества, фактически проблема личного тождества.
Пожалуйста. Можно? Спасибо большое за лекцию, это был очень интересный разговор. Меня зовут Александр. У меня простой для формулирования вопрос. Вы любите Дугласа Адамса, его Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? В этой книге есть такой вопрос, который имеет прямое отношение к информации и панпсихизму вообще. С одной стороны, Землю можно рассматривать как stuff, как просто материя. С другой стороны, если вы узнаете о том, что Земля — это гигантский суперкомпьютер, вы, наверное, склоняетесь к тому, чтобы считать, что у нее может быть сознание. Это ведет нас к проблеме информации. Панпсихизм постулирует существование некой сущности сознания, как space and time, как пространство и время. В то же время информация, она не такая, как пространство и время. Ее не существует таким образом, как существует пространство и время. Поэтому вопрос. не кажется ли вам вообще само слово информация как вещь, за которой скрывается огромное количество проблем именно для панпсихизма? Спасибо.
So, how does it connect to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? I love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I grew up on this. When I turned 42, which was 8 years ago now, I had a Life, the Universe, and Everything party, where everyone must come as a character from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So, since it was my party, I came as Zaphod Beeblebrox, with another head on my shoulder, and for the second head I had a mask of George W. Bush with a long-haired wig. Okay. Information, I agree the way we usually think about information, it's not fundamental, it's derivative. Some physicists, though, do take very seriously the idea that information may be fundamental in physics, and physics can be cast in terms of information. Sometimes this is called the it from bit program. You get objects from a fundamental level of information. I think it's something like that project you would have to pursue to make this work. It's particularly complicated for Tononi's theory, because integrated information, as he defines it, seems not to be fundamental. So to make this work, we may need some variation on Tononi.
Да, первая часть ответа это то, что да, конечно, это любимая книга, и Дэвид рассказал про вечеринки, в которых он участвовал, в которых он участвовал у него дома, да, и разные. Вот, но философская часть ответа заключается в следующем, что он скорее склоняется к тому, что информация является выводным элементом, и не является интегральной частью мира физического. Однако этот взгляд разделяется не всеми. И здесь некоторые физики даже полагают, что информация является частью природных таких базовых элементов. Однако, вот, если мы рассматриваем теорию Тонoni интегрированной информации, там, которой придерживается, которую симпатизирует Дэвид, то у нас здесь в ней, в рамках этой теории, информация не является базовым элементом, и она зависит от физического компонента. Поэтому для того, чтобы говорить об информации как части мира, как базовой части, нам необходимо провести значительные модификации в теории Tononi.
У нас как государственный дума уже очередь. Там...
Можно я? Скажите, пожалуйста, вы привели пример на тему футбольного поля, да, и замены каждого игрока, то есть вы владеете португальским, да, и постепенно меняя игроков, как бы ваше сознание все равно продолжает знать португальский, да, но при этом при большем количественное изменение игроков, оно приведет к тому, что по факту потом каждый из этих игроков знать уже португальский не будет, и вы вот как бы как сознание тоже португальский знать не будете. То есть получается, что изменяя информацию, да, вот как сознание, как информация, получается, что постоянно накапливая знания о сознании, вы изменяете свое сознание, и получается, что вы никогда не сможете узнать на самом деле, что такое сознание, потому что все время находится в изменении. То есть как ваше отношение к этому?
It's true that information as we understand it is structural, quantitative, and not qualitative exactly. So I think as part of these psychophysical laws, it must be the idea that somehow there are laws that project from the structural and the quantitative to something qualitative. So for example, in the structure of color vision, there are three fundamental axes, different shades and brightness, and it's all structural. Seen as an information space, it's just a three-dimensional space. So somehow in these psychophysical laws,
there must be laws that connect this three-dimensional structure of quantities to a three-dimensional structure of qualities. One gets filled in with red and green, another one gets filled in with blue and yellow. And as I'm seeing it, these qualities are somehow fundamental. And what we need to do is to understand the mapping from the structure to the quality. So my view is not reductionist. I don't try to reduce the qualities to the quantities or to the structure. I try to take it as irreducible, but find laws that can connect the two.
Да, конечно, ответ такой, что, конечно, информация представляет из себя количественное понятие. И именно поиск законов, личных, которые связывали информацию как количественное понятие, переводили в качественное, например, что касается теории восприятия, это качественная теория, которая описывает наше поле зрения, трехмерного типа, которые описывали эти качества, такие качества, как голубое, красное, таким образом, чтобы они связывали это с количественными терминами информации. Здесь вот самый такой фундаментальный вопрос. Однако это не значит, что теория Дэвида является теорией редукционистской. Он полагает, что наличие законов, которые бы связывали эти понятия, не является редукцией, не является сведением одного к другому, что они существуют в одинаковом смысле.
Добрый день и спасибо за лекцию. В общем, не знаю, как других, но у меня в последнее время сложилось такое немножко ощущение, что вот был какой-то такой всплеск по поводу трудной проблемы, но чем дальше мы уходим, чем дальше мы уходим, углубляемся в какие-то мелкие аспекты, тем дальше мы уходим от собственного решения трудной проблемы. И в последнее время, в последние годы, это какое-то такое вот прыгание от одной теории к другой, такое вот пережевывание мысленных экспериментов, вот как-то вот без каких-то новых реально идей, потому что трудная проблема кажется такой же неразрешенной, как, в общем-то, раньше, лет 20 назад, да? Ну, мне, в общем-то, не то чтобы или больше, чем 20, конечно, но это не видно. И в связи с этим второй подвопрос, чтобы не было как будто два вопроса. Собственно, не кажется ли вам, что возможно, чисто теоретически возможно, что вот через те же 300 лет все-таки трудная проблема будет выглядеть как те самые странные средневековые проблемы, которые, в общем-то, кажутся нам сейчас немножко выдуманными. Вот, спасибо.
The problem is hard, and progress in philosophy is slow. But I never expected that the problem would be solved in 20 years. I think what we've seen in the last 20 years is gradual increase in understanding, exploration of new options that hadn't been considered before. I think, the science is also moving fairly slowly. I think, I would expect, if you ask me what is the time frame for finding a really fundamental new breakthrough on this problem, it may be in the time frame of 50 to 100 years rather than 20 years. Nonetheless, I think it's important that we're exploring all of these options. One thing that could happen eventually is that after 100 years, the problem could dissolve. But I do think there's very good reasons to think this problem is not analogous to the problems of life or the problems of medieval abstractions. And it basically comes down to the fact that consciousness is a datum, a central feature of all of our lives. And I don't think that datum is going to be going away. So there are some people right now who think we're already in that situation. Dennett, for example. It wouldn't surprise me if in 300 years there are still people like Dennett who have this view, but I'd like to think that we may be in a situation where we actually have some positive, serious, scientific, non-reductionist theory of consciousness.
Да, конечно, если мы обращаем внимание на изменения количественные и качественные, то количественные изменения, постепенное нарастание нашего знания о трудной проблеме и постепенные научные подходы, которые формулируются, и эксперименты, которые были сделаны за последние 20 лет, могут не представляться извне как нечто революционное. Однако Дэвид никогда не предполагал 20 лет назад, что за 20 лет удастся решить трудную проблему сознания, и тем более в рамках науки о сознании. Возможно, через 50 или 100 лет, как он полагает. Однако, возможно, даже через 100 лет найдутся такие мыслители, как Деннет, например, которые сейчас полагают, что никакой проблемы нет, и она представляет себе такую разновидность средневековых проблем. В то же время его взгляд заключается в том, что сознание представляет из себя такую нередуцируемую данность, которую невозможно объяснить таким образом, чтобы она исчезла. И поэтому даже через 100 лет эта данность будет требовать понимания и качественного, и научного объяснения количественного.
Спасибо, Дэвид, за лекцию, но я не поверил своим ушам и глазам. В книге «Сознающий ум» вы очень настойчиво и неоднократно говорите о каузальной замкнутости физической. Правильно ли я понял, что склоняясь к четвертому тезису, который был на предыдущей странице, вы, в общем, склоняетесь отвергнуть теперь этот тезис? Скажите «да», я буду очень рад.
I think in the conscious mind I was critical of interactionism, and I said, and I was sympathetic with causal closure. I now think the criticisms of interactionist dualism there were too quick, and that in particular there is room for consciousness potentially to exert a causal role through the quantum collapse of the wave function. I don't know that it does, I don't know that it works that way. I just think there is the potential there for influence to be exerted. And I'm trying right now to see if we can develop rigorous theories along those lines. If consciousness does collapse the wave function, then yes, physics minus consciousness is not causally closed. Physics plus consciousness, of course, will be causally closed.
Ну, ответ такой, что в этой работе Дэвид полагал, что действительно, что интеракционистский дуализм является плохим с такой точки зрения. Но постепенно он более и более склоняется к такого рода взгляду. И сейчас краткий самый ответ заключается в том, что, конечно, каузально Вселенная плюс сознание является каузально замкнутой. Но Вселенная без сознания не является каузально замкнутой. Какая же частный механизм, точный механизм воздействия сознания на коллапс волновых функций является предметом исследования.
Профессор Чалмерс, спасибо большое за вашу лекцию. Я очень прошу прощения, если мой вопрос носит примитивный характер, но тем не менее я очень хотел бы вам его задать. Вы начали свою лекцию с цитаты из религиозного индуистского трактата, написанного за 600 лет до нашей эры. Мы затем продолжили скорее с философских и научных теорий и более касаясь религиозной проблематики. Считаете ли вы, что сложная проблема сознания может быть изучена только на основе научного опыта и философских размышлений, а религиозный опыт, например, нам не будет здесь полезным? Спасибо.
I'm not myself religious. I'm open to insights on the problem of consciousness from many different traditions. And I think many of the religious traditions have thought very seriously about consciousness. And I think these include especially the Indian traditions, the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. So I'm very much open to insights that come from this area. And I don't think they need to be religious insights. The insights you get from Hindu and Buddhist traditions for thinking about consciousness need have nothing to do with a God, but the insights they bring us about introspective insights about the structure of consciousness are valuable. So yes, I'm open to insights from the religious tradition.
Не являясь религиозным сам по себе, я полагаю, что в том числе в многих религиозных традициях, особенно в индийской, существовали наблюдения, инсайты по поводу природы сознания, по поводу интроспективной природы сознания, наблюдения за этим. Здесь не стоит в этом смысле различать научное и религиозное, противопоставлять, потому что эти озарения в области природы сознания не являются озарениями в области природы Бога. Да, и в этом смысле, будучи открытым для всех религиозных традиций, я полагаю, что мы можем брать те интуиции, которые наиболее здесь являются подходящими.
Спасибо. Вопрос такой. Книги свои, 20 лет назад, может, вы изменились с тех пор своей точки зрения, вы высказали мысль, что сознание можно создать над временем и я просто сейчас пытаюсь, слушаю вашу лекцию, я сам психолог, мысленный эксперимент такой, допустим, возьмем только что родившегося ребенка, у которого происходит бурный процесс образования нейронных связей. Все его как бы образование нейронных связей относится, этот ребенок, он банально хочет сосать в грудь. То есть он хочет выжить. То есть у него есть очень сильное желание выжить, которое присуще любому живому существу. Вот. И именно вокруг этого желания формируется все образование его сознания, которое у него в этот момент формируется. Вот. Поэтому в связи с этим вопрос, вокруг чего будет формироваться сознание кремниевого элемента, если оно не хочет жить? То есть потому что желание выжить присуще только живому существу по определению. Каким образом это будет происходить? Спасибо. Очень интересная лекция, замечательная книжка.
It sounds to me as if I should pass this question to my partner, Claudia Passos, who gave a wonderful talk yesterday in the Center for Consciousness Studies about the sense of consciousness and agency in newborn babies. But I think, babies are conscious, and their consciousness is partly structured by their needs, not wholly structured by their needs. I think that when a computer is conscious, its consciousness will also be partly structured by its needs. I think, the structure of my perception is not wholly structured by my needs. I think it's got a structure which is to some degree independent of my basic needs. But no doubt my needs make certain things salient and stand out. I don't see any reason why a computer might not itself have certain basic goals and values programmed into it, which would serve the same role for it in structuring its consciousness. In general, I think consciousness is probably a complex set of arises from a complex set of interactions between our goals and values and our beliefs and representations. I think this is true for a baby. It may well be equally true for a computer.
Мне кажется, что такой вопрос можно смело переадресовать Клаудии Пасос, который вчера делал как раз специалисту в области development of typology, и который вчера делал презентацию в Центре исследования сознания. Однако, несмотря на то, что Дэвид знает меньше, чем она, его точка зрения заключается в том, что точно так же, конечно, сознание формируется вокруг базовых нужд, однако базовые нужды не исчерпывают всю сферу того, вокруг чего формируется сознание. Точно таким образом, в качестве базовых нужд мы можем запрограммировать в компьютер его, по крайней мере, какую-то часть таким образом, его программного обеспечения, таким образом, чтобы у него существовала какая-то форма того, что мы называем ценностями или вот нуждами, вокруг которого могло бы сформироваться сознание машины.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chalmers, for your outstanding lecture, and I switch back to Russian to ask a question. Я задам вопрос немножечко в обратном порядке, он полностью касается лекции и вопроса сознания. В какую категорию вашей классификации и какие аргументы у вас есть против следующего взгляда на вопрос сознания, который говорит о том, что сознание — это некоторым образом ошибка нашего ума, глубоко запрятанная, но очень удобная для наших размышлений о самих себе и некоторым образом аналогичная, скажем, бесконечности в математике, да, которую мы даже не можем вообразить, но очень удобно ее использовать в вычислении. Спасибо.
It sounds to me like, on this view, consciousness is an illusion. It's a mistake that we produce in thinking about ourselves. The brain has a model of itself, and our self-model, on your view, adds something extra to the model, which doesn't exist in reality. So I would call this a version of illusionism about consciousness, and it would fall under what I call type A materialism. I think it's a very important project to try to find just what is the nature of that self-model. And for anyone, materialist or dualist, we should understand how the brain's model of itself introspectively works. And then for the type A materialist needs to make the case that it really is a mistake, that the brain really is here making a mistake. So I think it's an important view, it's a type A materialist view, and I hope that you and others can develop it in the years to come.
Такого рода такой взгляд Дэвид относит к иллюзионизму в области сознания, потому что каким-то образом часть ума и часть мозга, которая является такой ошибкой, и он относит его к иллюзионизму в области как в качестве иллюзионизма по поводу сознания, это часть материализма типа А. И материализм типа А, перед ним стоят очень важные задачи, реалистичные, которые, например, задача к объяснению того, каким образом эта ошибка в нашем мозге функционирует, как она рождается. Это очень важная проблема, которую материализм типа А должен решать. И он надеется, что больше людей будут заниматься вот именно такими проблемами в будущем.
Последние 3 вопроса.
Да, Дэвид, у меня вопрос такой. Не является ли проблема следствием мировоззрения того, кто эту проблему ставит? И тогда, если это так, она может решиться только изменением мировоззрения мыслящего, то есть ставящего проблему.
So the problem is produced by the Weltanschauung, by the worldview. So we could get rid of the problem by changing the worldview. I'm open, I always say, the problem of consciousness is difficult enough that we should be open to crazy ideas, to revolutionary ideas. And if the right revolution is to change the Weltanschauung, look, I suspect that any convincing theory of consciousness will involve a change in worldview, in Weltanschauung. Some very radical changes have been proposed by the likes of Dennett and Churchill, change the Weltanschauung so radically we get rid of the problem. The trouble is, nobody has yet been convinced. Very few people have been convinced of this because we're confronted. We just come back, we change our worldview for a moment, and we come back. We're confronted by the data of consciousness. So somehow this change in Weltanschauung needs to be made convincing enough that we no longer see this as a datum. Many have tried, no one has yet succeeded.
I mean, only if you will change your worldview, there will be no hard problem.
No, I'm sorry, there was a hard problem long before me, and even if I change my mind, there will still be a hard problem there.
Да, ответ на вопрос о мировоззрении тут двоякий. С одной стороны, конечно, такие изменения, радикальные изменения в мировоззрении были предложены. Например, Патрицией Чорчлем или Деннетом. Это изменения, которые, благодаря которым трудное управление сознанием вообще исчезало. Однако у таких таких подходов, таких точек зрения на мир очень мало сторонников, потому что нам с трудом удается, даже если мы убеждены в чем-то подобном, нам очень ненадолго удается пребывать в таком редукционистском ключе, и мы все равно, как мы сталкиваясь с данными сознания, с наличием этой данности, мы все равно переключаемся обратно на обычный тип. А вот по поводу второй части вопроса, если бы мировоззрение Дэвида изменилось, то он утверждает, что его мировоззрение ни при чем. То есть проблема существовала задолго до него.
А вопросы еще справа и слева, пожалуйста.
Уважаемый мистер Chalmers, вопрос, касающийся соотношения памяти и сознания. Memory and consciousness. С одной стороны, память – это физический процесс, точнее, физический объект, что можно объяснить с редукционистской или материалистической точки зрения. Мы достаточно много знаем о памяти и как память работает. С другой стороны, память содержит все то, что мы называем опытом или феноменом. Когда мы говорим о сознании, мы говорим зачастую именно о воспоминаниях. Например, буквально быть в сознании – это значит помнить, что происходило. В связи с этим вопрос достаточно простой, как уважаемый мистер Chalmers представляет себе проблему соотношения памяти и сознания.
I think memory is one aspect of consciousness. My consciousness consists in perception and emotion and thought and memory. So it's an aspect of consciousness. What is in my consciousness in one moment as perception may remain in my consciousness 10 seconds later as memory, and some small version of it may be left 1 year later as memory. But I'm inclined to think that memory is one important aspect, a subset of consciousness. Of course, there's also unconscious memory. So memory goes far beyond consciousness. Memory is an iceberg of which only the tip is in consciousness. So maybe it's like a Venn diagram. There's memory, there's consciousness, and there's some small intersection.
Дэвид полагает, что память является одной из фундаментальных частей сознания. Однако легче всего представить это в виде такой диаграммы Венна. Только небольшая часть памяти пересекается с сферой сознания. Большая часть памяти является бессознательной. В этом смысле, конечно, память является также центральной, но она, во-первых, она не исчерпывает всего сознания, а во-вторых, сознание не исчерпывает всю память. И в этом смысле, конечно, память представляет какой-то материальный коррелят, но при этом это пересечение не означает тождество.
Я вопрос, может быть, не совсем по теме, но возвращаясь к теме твоего поля, вы говорили о том, что если мы изменяем систему, не элементов, примерно, общее понимание картины остается, и там, у вас вы продолжаете так же знать прогресс. Тогда, по идее, если переносить это на нервную систему, если мозг могли бы постепенно заменяться, и мозг был бы некоторых повреждений мозга, критичных, избегать, просто восстанавливая их чисто. Почему этого не происходит? Почему нет клетки, имеют очень низкую регенерацию?
There's some regeneration in the brain, but it's limited. It's a question about in a computer. The thought is everything can regenerate. Well, in a computer, some things are fixed and some things are not fixed. I would think that if the brain could regenerate arbitrary neurons, it would be more powerful. So if a computer can regenerate its parts where brains cannot, this is a respect in which computers are less limited, not more limited. But if you want a computer to mirror the brain exactly, then you just need to write a computer algorithm with the right constraints, where we have a model of brain regeneration built into the algorithm, so that in certain limited circumstances, new cells can grow, and in other circumstances they don't. Now, whether Dennett built in all this to his model of the football stadium, maybe it wasn't necessary, because maybe he was just simulating 15 seconds in the life of a brain when we translate one sentence. But for a longer-term computational model of the mind, I think we need to model all the dynamic principles of change over time, which would include regeneration when that happens. But I don't see any reason in principle why that couldn't be modeled by a computer as well. Maybe we would need a more complex football stadium now where people occasionally sub in and substitute out, but I don't see any reason why this is impossible in principle.
Да, возможно, что идея Непрова заключалась в том, что он моделировал один процесс, 15 секунд работы мозга, который заключался в переводе. Конечно, для более сложных моделей нам было бы необходимо встроить в компьютерные системы более сложную многоуровневую модель этого стадиона, в которой бы некоторые люди заходили бы, некоторые выходили. Мы должны были бы встроить в эту модель ограниченную регенерацию, то есть некоторые части могли бы в мозге этого искусственно регенерироваться, некоторые не могли бы. Однако, то есть это напрямую не касается модели Непрова. Ну, конечно, нам для того, чтобы полностью воссоздать такого рода мозг и его взаимодействие, необходимо бы встроить было бы в компьютерной модели, запрограммировать бы, нужно было бы, конечно, эти ограничения, которые имеет реальный мозг. Может ли диалектический материализм решить трудные и легкие проблемы сознания?
Well, I always say we should be open to ideas from every avenue. So if dialectical materialism has the solution, please tell me, I'm all ears.
David говорит, что надо быть открытым ко всем путям, поэтому если у диалектического материализма есть ответ, то, пожалуйста, скажите об этом и слушаем.
Бог сейчас выберет сам, кто ответит, это будет последний вопрос.
Дэвид, спасибо большое за очень интересную лекцию. Я хотел бы вот такой вопрос. Как мы все знаем, обычно, как это называется, что субъективный опыт обладает чертой приватности. Я не знаю о Конституции другого человека, другой человек не знает
о том, что происходит в финансовом и так далее. Как я понимаю, дуализм и подобные теории так или иначе апеллируют к достаточно таким объективированным конструкциям. Информация или материя так или иначе предполагает полное отсутствие приватности сознания во взгляде, потому что мы имеем систему полностью выложенной пределами наблюдателя. Вот как эти теории могут преодолеть этот методологический конфликт, и возможно ли, что эта проблема будет решена именно чисто методологическим образом? В таком случае, спасибо.
I think, yeah, consciousness is private. We know about our own consciousness much more directly than we can know about anybody else's. I'm not sure it's the same as the hard problem, even if it was not. Even if I could know about your consciousness as directly as I know about mine, I think we would still have the hard problem. Why does physical processes give rise to my consciousness and to your consciousness? So it's not the same problem, but it does make the problem harder, especially for the science, because we don't have the data, or we don't have data about others' consciousness as a datum. The science would be much easier if we had a consciousness meter. I would wave it, searching for consciousness, and on the screen, there's a readout of the dean's consciousness. It doesn't work that way. Say we did work this way, then I think it would make it much easier to find the correlations and find the principles that connect physical processing to consciousness. But we would still be faced with the hard problem, and I suspect we would still have an argument between the materialists and the dualists. In any case, the situation we're in is a case where, if consciousness was wholly objective, probably from the start, this would have been a problem, to a very large, much larger degree, a problem of science. So maybe the privacy helps to make it a distinctive problem for philosophy.
Да, кратко это такое, что проблема приватности, личных опыта, субъективности является проблемой отдельной от проблемы, трудной проблемой сознания. Даже если бы существовал какой-нибудь прибор, который можно было провести над головой декана философского факультета и узнать количество сознания у него, если бы существовал его прибор, все равно осталась бы проблема, во-первых, приватности, и отдельно от нее трудная проблема, которая является проблемой объяснения. Приватность — это проблема эпистемическая, проблема знания, потому что мы знаем сознание других. А трудная проблема из другой области, проблема объяснения того, как из физического, как связаны эти вещи, как может порождать нечто, одно другое. Поэтому, конечно, было бы очень легко, если бы проблема приватности могла бы решаться научным образом, но тогда бы трудная проблема была просто научная проблема, которую бы рано или поздно решили с помощью философов. Однако это не так.
Объявление сейчас.
Да, я хотел поблагодарить всех тех, кто пришел сегодня на эту лекцию. И у нас будет публикация нескольких материалов по итогам сегодняшнего интервью с Дэвидом Чалмерсом. Там будет очень много вопросов, которые вы задавали, и он более развернуто рассказывает свою позицию на этот счет. Поэтому, пожалуйста, следите, приблизительно через 2 недели это будет на сайте hardproblem.ru. Спасибо большое.